For 30 years, I lived by a rule I did not create and never questioned. I built my days around locked doors, dim rooms, and careful distance. I timed my showers, knocked before entering my own bedroom, and learned the geography of my house by sound alone. I never once saw my wife unclothed. Not when we were young. Not when she carried our children. Not when age softened her body or illness crept into her mind. Darkness was the price of peace, and I paid it faithfully, believing love sometimes meant not asking why. The rule survived everything: marriage, children, grandchildren. It outlasted careers, funerals, and time itself. Until one morning, after breakfast, when I heard her fall behind a locked bathroom door and understood that obedience could become fatal. When I broke that door open, I broke 30 years of silence with it. What I saw in that moment explained our entire life together, and it arrived too late to change the past, but just in time to change how the end would unfold. If you've ever lived with a rule you didn't understand, one you carried out of love or fear or loyalty, I ask you, quietly, to stay with me through this story. Consider subscribing, not out of habit, but because these stories matter when they're shared. And if you've lived under a silence like mine, tell me about it in the comments. Sometimes understanding arrives only after everything else is gone. The rule did not arrive suddenly. It eased its way into my life the way certain weather patterns do in the South, quietly, persistently, until you forget what clear air ever felt like. When I met my wife, I was 32 and steady in ways I mistook for wisdom. She was reserved, polite, careful with her body in a manner I read as modesty. We were courting in a town where people still shook hands properly and spoke softly about private things. When she declined swimming invitations, laughed off beach trips, or changed clothes behind closed doors even when no one else was home, I didn't question it. I told myself some people simply carried themselves differently. That respect meant not pressing. I remember our honeymoon most clearly for what was missing. The lights were always off. Not dim, off. Complete darkness, as if sight itself were an intrusion. I assumed nerves. Newness. Love learning its shape. When I reached for the bathroom door one evening and found it locked, I apologized through the wood, embarrassed by my own presence. She said nothing, only waited until I had moved away before unlocking it again. That pattern never changed. By the time we bought our first house, a modest place with creaking floors and too many doors, I had already begun reorganizing myself around her boundaries. I learned to shower early or late. I learned to keep my shaving kit in the guest bathroom. I learned to announce myself in my own hallway. I learned to accept that intimacy would always arrive wrapped in darkness, that touch would exist without sight, that love would be something felt rather than witnessed. I never asked why. Marriage has a way of normalizing the unusual. You tell yourself that every household has its systems, its unspoken rules. Ours just happened to involve locks and light switches and a shared agreement not to look too closely. When the children came, the rule adapted. Doctors' visits were solo affairs. Hospital rooms were managed with blankets and curtains and firm instructions. Bath time was private. Bedroom doors were closed. The kids learned early that their mother valued privacy above all else, and I was the one who explained it away, gently, repeatedly, until it became family doctrine. She just likes her space, I would say. And that was mostly true. Or at least, it was the truth I could live with. Years passed the way years do, quietly stacking themselves one atop another. The children grew and left. Grandchildren arrived, loud and bright, filling rooms she navigated carefully, always fully dressed, always composed. The rule held. It was unbreakable. I had stopped noticing it as something strange and began to think of it as architectural, like load-bearing beams you don't touch because the house depends on them. Then her memory began to fray. At first it was small things, misplaced keys, repeated questions, moments of confusion that passed as quickly as they came. When the diagnosis arrived, spoken gently by a doctor who had learned how to soften hard truths, my role shifted. I became a watcher. A reminder. A keeper of routines. Through it all, she clung to the rule with surprising force. If anything, it grew sharper. The bathroom door locked more quickly. Assistance was refused more firmly. Privacy became something she defended even as other parts of herself slipped away. I honored it. Even when it scared me. I would sit outside the bathroom listening to the water run too long, imagining her standing there unsure of what came next. I would offer help and accept refusal. Love, I believed, still meant respect. Until the morning the sound I heard was not water, but impact. A heavy, final sound that did not belong in any normal routine. That was the moment obedience gave way to fear. And fear, as I would soon learn, was something she had been living with long before she ever met me. Our house learned us the way old houses do, slowly, through repetition. The floorboards near the bathroom softened where I paused each morning, listening for the sound of the lock before deciding whether to turn back. The hallway light stayed off most nights, not because we liked darkness, but because light suggested movement, and movement suggested intrusion. Even the mirrors seemed decorative rather than functional, placed where no one ever lingered long enough to be reflected. I didn't resent any of it. That's the truth that still surprises people when I tell them. Resentment requires a sense of injustice, and I never allowed myself to believe I was being wronged. I believed I was being trusted. There is a difference, even if it leads you to the same quiet places. Raising children inside those boundaries required explanation without explanation. They learned early that bathroom doors stayed closed, that knocking was not optional, that their mother's bedroom was a place entered only by invitation. When they were small, it was easy. Children accept rules the way they accept gravity. When they grew older and asked questions, I gave answers that were smooth and incomplete. Some people need more privacy, I would say. Your mother feels safer that way. We respect the people we love. None of those statements were lies. They were just not complete truths. During her pregnancies, the rule became almost ceremonial. Appointments were handled alone. Hospital staff were managed firmly but politely. I sat in waiting rooms reading old magazines while my wife labored behind closed doors, attended by strangers who were instructed to look only where necessary and never longer than required. When the babies were placed in my arms, wrapped and crying and very much alive, I felt a pride that pushed every other thought aside. Whatever compromises we had made, they had brought us here. That felt like proof enough that we were doing something right. At home, motherhood unfolded behind doors. Bathing was private. Feeding was done fully clothed, even when it meant awkward angles and long nights. I would hear her humming softly through the wall, a low, steady sound meant more for herself than anyone else. The children grew secure and loved, and that mattered more to me than understanding every choice that had shaped their days. Years layered themselves gently. Careers advanced. School plays came and went. Holidays filled the house with noise and then released it again. The rule remained untouched, unquestioned even by me. It had become part of the structure of who we were. To question it felt like questioning the marriage itself. When the children left, the house grew quieter but not lonelier. We had learned how to be alone together. Evenings were spent side by side, reading or watching television, our bodies close but not exposed, our intimacy expressed through familiarity rather than display. I knew the sound of her breathing better than the shape of her back. I knew her moods by the way she set down a cup. I knew when to speak and when to let silence do the work. That is why the changes unsettled me so deeply when they began. The first time she forgot where she was, she laughed it off. The second time, she grew irritated with herself. The third time, she looked at me with something like suspicion, as if I were part of a trick she could not quite understand. Through it all, the rule remained intact. If anything, it hardened. The locks clicked faster. The refusals came sooner. I watched her struggle with buttons she had fastened for decades, with faucets that suddenly seemed unfamiliar. I offered help in ways that tried not to sound like help. She declined every time. The bathroom became the last territory she believed she controlled completely. I began to fear the place that had once felt so ordinary. In the mornings, I would linger over coffee, listening for sounds that told me she was upright, oriented, safe. Some days there was singing. Other days, only running water. Too much water. Long stretches of it, uninterrupted, until my stomach tightened with unease. Still, I stayed where I was. Respect had become reflex. Until the morning reflex nearly cost her life. The sound that reached me after breakfast was not confusion or water or humming. It was wait. Sudden. Final. A sound that carries meaning before thought can catch up to it. And in that moment, 30 years of habit stood between me and the woman I loved. The sound was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't a slip, not the quick skid of a foot or the startled shuffle of someone catching themselves. It was heavier than that. Final. A full-bodied impact that seemed to shake the walls inward. For half a second afterward, there was nothing, no water, no movement, no voice. Silence rushed in so fast it felt loud. I was on my feet before I realized I'd stood up. I called her name once, then again, keeping my voice calm out of instinct, as if panic might make things worse. There was no answer. I crossed the hallway and stopped in front of the bathroom door, my hand already raised to knock even though every part of me knew knocking no longer applied. The door was locked. That click, the small, familiar certainty of it, hit me harder than the fall itself. 30 years of conditioning pressed down on me at once. Wait. Respect. Don't cross this line. My hand hovered uselessly against the wood while my mind argued with itself in fragments. She could be stunned. She could be unconscious. She could be dying. I called her name again, louder now, letting urgency into my voice. Still nothing. The water was running. I could hear it clearly now, a steady, relentless sound that had no awareness of what had just happened. In that moment, the rule finally revealed its true cost. I did not think about dignity or promises or habit. I thought about the weight of her body hitting tile and the length of time it had already been since the sound. I stepped back once and drove my shoulder into the door. The frame groaned but held. I stepped back again, feeling something hot and sharp tear through my shoulder as the door finally gave way with a crack that echoed down the hall. Steam rolled out at me, thick and blinding. The room was too warm, the air heavy with moisture. The shower was still running, water beating down against the far wall. She lay on the floor beside the tub, unmoving, her body angled in a way that told me immediately she had not caught herself. And for the first time in my life, I saw my wife. Not in pieces. Not in suggestion. Fully. Completely. Uncovered. The sight itself stunned me, not because of nakedness, but because of what lay beneath it. Her back was a map of pain I had never known existed. Skin warped and uneven, pulled tight in places and puckered in others, the coloration wrong, unnatural. Long stretches of it looked older than the rest of her body, as if time had passed differently there. Even through the steam and my own shock, I understood what I was seeing before my mind had time to name it. Burns. Not recent. Not accidental. Old, extensive, deliberate damage that had healed without ever truly recovering. The kind of scarring that doesn't come from a brief mistake but from something prolonged, something inflicted. I dropped to my knees beside her, my thoughts finally returning to function. I shut off the water, grabbed towels, covered her quickly, not to hide her from myself, but to give her the safety I suddenly understood she had been defending her entire life. Her eyes fluttered open then, unfocused, wild with fear. She didn't look at the blood on her arm or the way she struggled to breathe. She looked at me. And the panic on her face had nothing to do with the fall. It was the terror of being seen. I told her it was all right. I told her she was safe. I told her I was sorry, though I didn't yet know exactly what I was apologizing for. I lifted her carefully, feeling how light she had become, and carried her to the bed, wrapping her in blankets the way I should have done years ago, without asking permission, but with care. She clung to the edge of consciousness, whispering apologies I didn't understand, trying to pull the covers tighter even as her body trembled. I stayed with her, speaking softly, grounding her in the present until the shaking eased and her breathing slowed. Only then, when the immediate danger had passed, did I sit back and allow the truth to reach me fully. The rule had never been about modesty. It had been about survival. And the house we had built together, every lock, every darkened room, had been a shelter against a past she never believed could stay buried if brought into the light. The understanding arrived all at once, heavy and irreversible. But the story itself was still waiting to be told. She slept for a long time after that. Not the light, restless sleep she'd known in recent months, but something deeper, pulled from exhaustion rather than peace. I stayed beside the bed, afraid that if I moved too far away the moment might fracture, that the fragile calm we had reached would not hold. I replayed the image in my mind again and again, not with curiosity, but with a kind of stunned reverence. Those scars were not something I had seen so much as something I had finally been allowed to understand. They rearranged 30 years of memory in quiet, brutal ways. Every locked door. Every refusal. Every inch of darkness we had lived inside. None of it had been arbitrary. It had been armor. When she woke, she didn't speak right away. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the open door, the light filtering through the curtains, my chair pulled close to the bed. I watched her realize, piece by piece, that something fundamental had changed. She turned her face slightly away from me, even wrapped in blankets, even now. The reflex was still there. "I didn't mean for you to see," she said finally. Her voice was thin, stripped of strength, and for the first time in all our years together, it carried no authority. Only fear. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong. I told her she'd fallen. I told her I was glad I was there. My words came slowly, carefully chosen, not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because I knew now how much weight words could carry for her. She closed her eyes. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The house felt different, exposed somehow, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to the absence of a rule they had long upheld. Eventually, she spoke again, not looking at me, her voice distant, as though she were narrating someone else's life. She told me about a kitchen that was not hers. About a stove that had always been too hot, a pot that should never have been where it was. About hands that were careless and angry and used heat as punishment rather than accident. She told me about water that scalded instead of cleaned, about pain that did not end quickly, about silence afterward that was enforced rather than chosen. She had been a child. I sat perfectly still as she spoke, because any movement felt like an interruption. The story came out unevenly, not chronologically, not cleanly. Trauma rarely respects order. What mattered was not the details themselves, but the shape they formed together. Control had become her refuge. Concealment had been safety. If she could decide when she was seen, she could decide when she was hurt. By the time she finished, the room felt heavier, but also strangely clearer. There were no questions left to ask, only truths to absorb. "I couldn't let it be normal," she said quietly. "If it was normal, it could happen again." I understood then why the rule had never softened, never evolved. It was not a preference. It was a line drawn against chaos. And I had honored it because I loved her, even without knowing what I was protecting. I reached for her hand, not hesitantly, not with permission, just gently, as one human reaches for another when words are no longer useful. She didn't pull away. From that day on, the lock stayed open. Not because she forgot the rule, but because she no longer needed it in the same way. The illness had stripped away her ability to maintain such strict control, but the truth had given her something else in its place: predictability without secrecy, care without concealment. We moved slowly, together, renegotiating a life that no longer needed to hide from itself. I helped her bathe after that, not always easily, not without moments of fear, but always with the light on and my movements announced before they happened. She learned to trust the sequence of things rather than the absence of sight. I learned that intimacy could be built on transparency as much as it had once been built on darkness. When we told the children, they listened differently than I expected. There was no shock, only a quiet rearranging of memory, the same thing I had gone through. They saw their mother not as distant or private, but as resilient. They saw the rule for what it had been, a survival instinct that lasted longer than it needed to. The disease continued its work, patient and unkind. But something essential had already been resolved. The house breathed easier. The mirrors no longer felt accusatory. The bathroom door stayed open, a small, ordinary miracle. She died at home, years later, in her own bed, with her hand in mine and nothing left hidden between us. I still live here. The rule never came back. After the lock stayed open, the house had to relearn us. That may sound like sentimentality, but it isn't. When a place has been shaped by ritual for decades, removing one rule doesn't create freedom right away, it creates uncertainty. Doors that had always been closed now stood ajar, and sometimes she would stop in the hallway, confused, as if something essential had been misplaced. In the early weeks after the fall, I learned a new kind of attentiveness. Not the old vigilance that listened for water running too long, but something gentler and more deliberate. I narrated my movements. I asked before touching. I kept routines exact, not because she demanded them, but because predictability calmed her in ways privacy once had. Now I'm turning on the water. I'm going to help you step in. I'm right here. These phrases became our new structure. Where darkness had once protected her, sequence now did. She could follow the order of things even when her memory failed her, and that gave her back a sense of control that the illness had been steadily eroding. There were difficult days. Days when she recoiled despite everything, when old fear surged up faster than reason. On those days, I did not insist. I sat on the edge of the tub, towels ready, and waited. Patience, I had learned, was not passive. It was active restraint, a decision made again and again not to force healing on a timeline it would not follow. The children visited more often after we told them the truth. Not out of guilt, but understanding. They moved through the house differently now, with a new kind of reverence. Their mother's silences made sense to them at last, and I watched something soften in the way they spoke to her, the way they listened even when her words came out tangled or misplaced. As the disease progressed, her need for the old rule faded completely. Memory took with it the sharp edges of fear, leaving behind only impressions, heat, danger, safety, that surfaced without context. When she became frightened, it was no longer about being seen. It was about being lost. And I could help with that. There is a quiet dignity in caregiving that no one explains to you beforehand. It is not heroic. It is repetitive. It is made of small decisions and long afternoons and a constant recalibration of what matters. I fed her. I bathed her. I helped her dress and undress without either of us flinching. The body she had hidden for a lifetime became simply the body of the woman I loved, changed, scarred, aging, human. The scars no longer shocked me. They became familiar, like landmarks on a road I finally understood. I learned how her skin pulled more tightly in certain places, how water temperature mattered more for her than for most, how gentleness was not optional but essential. In caring for her openly, I felt closer to her than I ever had in darkness. When the end came, it was quiet. No locks. No rules. Just the slow, steady letting go of a life that had been held together by will for far longer than anyone had a right to expect. Afterward, the house settled again. Some habits never left me. I still pause in the hallway sometimes, listening. I still knock, out of instinct more than necessity. But when I open doors now, there is nothing to fear behind them. No silence waiting to be protected. No rule demanding obedience. Only memory. And the understanding that love, real love, is not about never crossing boundaries, but knowing when crossing them is the only way to keep someone alive. Time does not stop when understanding arrives. It only changes texture. After her death, people told me I was strong. I nodded because that is what you do when strength is assigned to you by someone who does not know what else to say. Strength was never the point. Endurance was. Quiet continuation. Learning how to wake up in a house that no longer required vigilance, yet still carried the imprint of it in every corner. I stayed in the same bedroom. I kept the same routine. Coffee at the same hour. Windows opened the same way. The bathroom door remained open, not as a statement, but because closing it felt unnecessary now, like keeping a rule alive after its purpose had finally been fulfilled. Grief did not arrive all at once. It came in layers, thin and persistent. Some days it was sharp, catching me off guard when I reached for a towel and remembered how carefully I once placed them. Other days it was dull, like pressure behind the eyes that never quite turned into tears. I learned that mourning was not about missing what you had, but reinterpreting everything you thought you understood. I replayed our marriage differently now. Scenes I had once categorized as neutral shifted into something heavier, more deliberate. The way she positioned herself near walls. The way she flinched when water temperature changed too quickly. The way she controlled light not just in rooms, but in conversations. None of it felt like mystery anymore. It felt like evidence I had not known how to read. I don't blame myself for that. Love is not a forensic exercise. You work with the information you are given, and sometimes the most important facts are hidden for reasons that have nothing to do with trust and everything to do with survival. She had given me what she could, when she could. And when she finally gave me the truth, I did not drop it. I held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that has already survived too much. The children called often after she was gone. Sometimes we talked about her. Sometimes we talked around her. They were processing their own versions of the story, learning how a childhood can be both safe and incomplete at the same time. I let them do that work without interference. Each of us carried a different piece of the same truth. The grandchildren asked fewer questions. They accepted absence more easily than adults do. To them, the house simply became quieter. They played where they always had, unaware of the significance of unlocked doors or lit rooms. I watched them and felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Peace is different. It is the absence of fear, not the presence of joy. Some nights, I still dreamed of the rule. In those dreams, I would reach for a door and hesitate, unsure whether I was allowed to open it. Then I would wake up and remember that there was no one left to protect in that way. The rule had served its purpose. It had carried us as far as it could. Understanding came late, but not too late. I lived long enough to see that love can be faithful even when it is incomplete, that respect can coexist with ignorance, and that truth does not always arrive when it is most useful, only when it is most possible. And when I move through the house now, alone but unafraid, I know this much for certain. Nothing is locked anymore. Nothing needs to be hidden. And nothing that mattered was ever truly lost. There is a moment that comes after the worst has already passed, when you realize you are no longer surviving something, you are simply living with what's left. That moment did not arrive for me all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as ordinary days. I began noticing how little effort it took to move through the house now. Not physically, I was older, slower, but mentally. I no longer planned my steps around sound or light. I didn't calculate time spent in rooms or listen for cues before turning a handle. The vigilance that had once defined my love had loosened its grip, and in its place was something softer, almost unfamiliar. Freedom, I suppose. But not the kind people celebrate. Freedom can feel like emptiness when it arrives late. I found myself sitting in rooms I once avoided. The bathroom, in particular, became a place I lingered, not out of morbid curiosity, but because it had been the last stronghold of a life built on concealment. I cleaned it slowly, methodically, noticing details I had never allowed myself to absorb before. The way the light fell across tile. The faint discoloration on the grout. The echo of space that had once been closed to me. It struck me then that love does not always demand access. Sometimes it demands patience. And sometimes, when access finally comes, it is not the gift you imagine, it is simply responsibility arriving in another form. People ask me if I wished I had known earlier. It's a fair question, but an incomplete one. Knowing earlier would have changed things, yes, but it would also have changed her. She was not withholding truth out of cruelty or distrust. She was preserving a version of herself she needed in order to function. Earlier knowledge might have brought earlier compassion, but it might also have brought fear, shame, or a sense of exposure she was not ready to survive. Understanding has timing. It does not always serve the living best when it arrives early. Sometimes it waits until the weight of it can be carried. I kept her things for a long time. Longer than necessary. Her clothes hung where she left them, untouched, not out of denial, but respect. Eventually, I let the children take what they wanted. I donated the rest. The house grew barer, but lighter. Like it was exhaling. The rule, once so absolute, became a story I told carefully, only when asked, only to those who understood that privacy can be a form of courage. I did not frame it as tragedy. I framed it as adaptation. Survival reshaped into habit, habit reshaped into life. If there is a lesson here, it is not about secrets or scars or even forgiveness. It is about the quiet agreements we make with the people we love, often without fully understanding them. It is about choosing kindness in the absence of explanation. It is about trusting that not every door is meant to be opened right away. Some are meant to stay closed until they no longer need to be locked. And when they finally open, they do so not with drama, but with understanding, soft, late, and sufficient. That is what remained for me. Not regret. Not anger. Just a calm acceptance that love carried us as far as it could. And that, in the end, was enough. As time passed, I noticed I had stopped explaining myself. For years, decades, really, I had been translating our life into something acceptable for other people. Explaining why doors were locked. Why lights were off. Why my wife never joined certain gatherings, never swam, never shared space the way others did. I had been a quiet interpreter, smoothing over questions before they fully formed, making our life legible to the outside world. After she was gone, that habit faded. When someone asked why I still lived alone in a house that was too big for me, I didn't give the practical answer about memories or finances. I simply said, because this is where my life is. And that was enough. When neighbors commented on how calm I seemed, how well I was handling things, I let the words pass without correcting them. Handling implies effort, struggle, resistance. What I felt instead was a slow settling. Like dust after a long disturbance. Like water finding its level. I stopped offering the story preemptively. I waited to be asked. And most people didn't ask, not really. They sensed, I think, that this was not a story meant for curiosity. It required listening of a particular kind, and not everyone knows how to do that. On quiet afternoons, I found myself revisiting small, ordinary moments from our marriage with new eyes. Not the dramatic ones. The ones I had once dismissed as background. The way she always checked the stove twice before turning away. The way she preferred long sleeves even in summer. The way she positioned herself in photographs, angled just slightly away from the camera. None of it felt haunting. It felt instructive. Like reading marginal notes left behind by someone who never expected you to read the book cover to cover. I also noticed something else, something gentler. Without the rule, without the constant need to protect her boundaries, I had more room to feel my own. I realized how much of my emotional life had been spent outward, focused on maintaining balance, keeping things smooth, absorbing tension so it wouldn't reach her. That wasn't a complaint. It was simply an accounting. Now, there was space. Some evenings I sat on the porch longer than usual, watching the light fade without thinking about whether it should be on or off. Other nights I slept with the bedroom door open, not for any reason other than the quiet comfort of airflow and openness. These were not acts of rebellion or healing. They were just choices I was finally free to make without consequence. Grief, when it returned, did so softly. It came as appreciation rather than ache. I missed her, of course, but I also felt gratitude for the life we had built without ever fully understanding its blueprint. We had navigated something complex with limited information and still arrived at something solid. That counts for more than people realize. I sometimes wonder what she would think if she could see the house now. The open doors. The steady light. The absence of urgency. I don't imagine she would feel exposed. I think she would feel relieved. Not because the rule was wrong, but because it was no longer necessary. And maybe that is the truest measure of love. Not that it lasts forever in its original form, but that it adapts, loosens, and eventually lets go when holding on no longer serves anyone. That is what I carry with me now. Not the rule. Not the scars. But the quiet knowledge that we did the best we could with what we had, and that, in the end, it was enough. There are questions people never quite bring themselves to ask out loud. You can hear them in the way they pause, in the way their eyes linger a moment too long on your face before they change the subject. I've learned to recognize those moments and let them pass. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I imagine what I would say if someone did ask the right question. If someone asked me whether I felt cheated by the rule, I would tell them no. Cheated implies a transaction gone wrong, a bargain broken. What we had was not a bargain. It was a covenant shaped by fear I did not yet understand and love that did not require full disclosure to be real. If someone asked me whether I wished I had pushed harder, demanded answers, insisted on light, I would tell them that insistence is a blunt instrument. It breaks as much as it reveals. She survived her past by controlling what could touch her, and I honored that because honoring it kept her alive. That matters more than curiosity ever could. If someone asked me whether it hurt to learn the truth so late, I would tell them yes, but not in the way they expect. It hurt not because I felt excluded, but because I finally understood how long she had been carrying that pain alone, even while sharing a life with me. The hurt was empathy arriving late, heavy with all the years it could not change. And if someone asked me what love really looks like after 30 years, after illness, after secrets finally laid bare, I would tell them this. Love looks like adaptation. It looks like patience without explanation. It looks like building a life around someone else's invisible wounds and never calling them a burden. It looks like breaking a door when the rule behind it threatens the life you are trying to protect, and then never apologizing for that part. I don't tell these things often. Not because I am guarding them, but because they don't belong everywhere. Some truths are not meant to travel widely. They are meant to sit quietly with the people who need them and wait. What I know now is simple and complete. We lived honestly, even when honesty didn't look like disclosure. We loved faithfully, even when love meant restraint. And when the time came, we let the light in, not to expose, but to heal. That is the story I carry forward. Not as a lesson. Not as a warning. Just as proof that a life can be built carefully around pain, and still be a good one. There is a competence that comes late in life, one no one teaches you. It isn't skill or confidence or even wisdom. It is the ability to let things be finished without trying to improve the ending. I learned that after she was gone. For a while, I kept expecting something more to happen, some final realization, some delayed reckoning that would rearrange everything again. Stories train us to believe there is always another turn, another revelation waiting just ahead. But real life is often quieter than that. Sometimes the most honest ending is simply continuation. I kept the house clean, but not obsessively. I cooked for myself without ceremony. I learned which routines mattered and which had only existed to support the rule. Some fell away naturally. Others lingered, not out of necessity, but familiarity. I stopped correcting people who spoke about my wife as if she had been fragile. Fragility suggests weakness. What she had was precision. Every boundary she maintained had been measured against what it cost her to relax it. That is not weakness. That is calculation born of experience. In the evenings, I read. Slowly. I found myself drawn to books that were less about answers and more about observation. Men who noticed things late in life. Women who survived by reshaping themselves rather than confronting the world head-on. Stories that didn't reward confrontation so much as endurance. Occasionally, someone would suggest I downsize, move closer to family, start over somewhere new. They meant well. But starting over is a young person's fantasy. At my age, you don't start over, you continue with awareness. This house holds a complete life. Not a perfect one. Not an easy one. But a whole one. I can walk through it and know exactly why each thing is where it is. I don't need novelty. I need coherence. The bathroom door still swings freely. Sometimes I notice it and feel a brief, almost imperceptible tightening in my chest, an echo of old reflex. Then it passes. Reflex fades faster than memory, and memory fades faster than meaning. What remains is understanding. Understanding that love does not require total access. Understanding that protection can look like distance. Understanding that the people we live with may be fighting battles we will never fully see, even if we share a bed with them for decades. I am not sad every day. I am not peaceful every day. Most days, I am simply present. That is enough. If there is dignity in aging, it comes from knowing when to stop demanding more from the past. I don't interrogate it anymore. I don't replay scenes looking for missed clues. The truth arrived when it was able, and I met it with care. That is the only obligation I had. The rest is living. And living, I have found, is quieter than people expect, but no less full. There is only one rule left now, and it is mine. I do not rush the quiet. In the early months after her death, well-meaning people tried to fill the silence for me. Invitations arrived. Suggestions followed. You should stay busy, they said, as if stillness were a problem to be solved. I thanked them and declined more often than not. Busyness had never been the point of my life. Attention had. I had spent decades paying close attention to another human being, her rhythms, her fears, her unspoken limits. When that responsibility ended, the absence of it felt vast, but not empty. It felt earned. Like a field left fallow after a long season of use. I learned how to sit with that. Mornings are my favorite now. The house is honest in the morning. Light arrives slowly, without demand. I make coffee and drink it where the sun first reaches the floor. Some days I think of her. Some days I don't. Both feel acceptable. Memory does not require constant visitation to remain real. I still take care with certain things. I test the water temperature before stepping in, even though no one else depends on me to do it. I fold towels the way she preferred, not because I must, but because it feels like speaking a language I'm fluent in. These habits don't bind me. They anchor me. Occasionally, I think about the man I was when the rule first appeared in my life. Younger. Less informed. Certain that love meant accommodating without understanding. I don't judge him. He did what many of us do, he honored what was asked of him and trusted that the rest would reveal itself in time. It did. Not neatly. Not early. But honestly. If there is a warning hidden in my story, it is a gentle one: do not assume silence means simplicity. People are often far more complex than the boundaries they draw. But if there is guidance, it is this: respect does not require explanation to be real. Sometimes the most ethical choice is to accept what you are given and care for it without demand. I kept the rule because it protected her. I broke it because it saved her. I released it because it was no longer needed. That is the full arc of it. No drama. No reckoning. Just adaptation, followed by release. In the end, the house is quiet in a way that feels deserved. Not hollow. Not waiting. Simply settled. Like a life that has been lived carefully, then set down. I move through it slowly now, with no doors locked against me and no light I'm afraid to turn on. And that, I've learned, is not freedom. It's peace. There comes a point when you realize you are no longer inside the story, you are standing at a distance from it, able to see its shape. I reached that point quietly, one afternoon, while replacing a burned-out light bulb in the hallway. I stood on the step stool longer than necessary, holding the new bulb in my hand, noticing how natural it felt to let the light fill the space. No hesitation. No instinct to dim it. Just illumination, simple and unremarkable. That was when I understood something important. Our life had not been defined by what was missing. It had been defined by what was maintained. Stability. Respect. A long, unbroken commitment to one another's survival. The rule was only one visible feature of something much larger, a marriage that functioned not through confrontation, but through accommodation and trust. People like stories with villains. They like clean lines between harm and healing. But our life did not work that way. The harm came long before me. The healing arrived slowly, imperfectly, and not all at once. And love, real love, operated in the space between those two things without needing to resolve them completely. I never saw her scars as something tragic after that first moment. They were evidence. Proof that a child had endured something terrible and grown into a woman who built an entire life anyway. Who raised children. Who loved carefully. Who stayed. That matters. As I grow older now, I think less about what might have been different and more about what was enough. We were enough for each other. Not in the way novels describe, but in the way real lives require. Enough patience. Enough loyalty. Enough restraint. Enough courage. When my time comes, and I feel it more clearly now than I once did, I don't expect revelation or reunion or answers waiting on the other side. I expect quiet. The same quiet I live with now. And I am not afraid of it. If someone were to walk through this house after I am gone, they would see nothing unusual. Just open doors. Lighted rooms. Ordinary furniture. No sign of the rule that once governed everything. And that feels right. Some lives are loud. Some are hidden. Some are simply careful. Ours was careful. And in the end, careful was enough. I have begun to think about what remains after me, not with urgency, but with the same calm attention that shaped the rest of my life. I sorted through papers one afternoon, deeds, insurance, old receipts kept long past their usefulness. I labeled things clearly. I made notes where explanation might be needed. Not because I expect confusion, but because clarity is a kindness when you are no longer there to provide it yourself. I walked the house room by room, not to inspect it, but to acknowledge it. This room held laughter. That one held worry. Another held long silences that were never empty. I realized that memory does not attach itself to objects as much as we think. It attaches to patterns, where you stood, how you waited, what you learned to accept without protest. There is no plaque for endurance. No record of the things you chose not to demand. But those are the choices that shape a life just as much as the loud ones. I left instructions for practical things. Accounts. Contacts. What to keep. What to let go. But there are no instructions for understanding. That has to be discovered, if it is discovered at all. If my children ever tell this story, they will tell it in pieces, shaped by what they remember and what they learned later. That is as it should be. No one inherits the full truth of another person's life. They inherit fragments and do their best to assemble meaning from them. What I hope they inherit from me is not the story itself, but the posture I lived it with. Patience. Attention. A willingness to protect what you do not yet understand. I did not save her from her past. I could not. I only stood between it and the life we were building, quietly, for as long as I was able. That was my role. I fulfilled it. When I am gone, there will be no rule left to explain, no silence that needs guarding. Just an ordinary house with ordinary doors that open easily, and light that fills rooms without resistance. That is what I leave behind. Not secrecy. Not sorrow. But a finished life, lived carefully, and set down without regret. There is nothing left to resolve. That may be the strangest truth of all. After everything, after the rule, the fall, the revelation, the years of care, there is no loose end pulling at me, no unfinished sentence waiting to be completed. The story ended where it needed to end, not with spectacle, but with understanding. I leave the light on in the hallway now. Not all the time. Just often enough that it feels intentional. It's a small thing, easily overlooked, but it reminds me that what once required protection no longer does. The light isn't defiant. It isn't symbolic. It's simply there, steady, unafraid of what it might reveal. If I have learned anything worth carrying forward, it is this: love does not always ask for truth immediately. Sometimes it asks for patience first, and trust second, and understanding last. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, it gives you all three, even if the order surprises you. I did not fail her by not knowing sooner. I did right by her by believing her boundaries mattered, even when I did not understand their origin. And when knowing became necessary, when silence threatened life itself, I stepped through it without hesitation. That is the part one hold on to. People talk about closure as if it's a door you shut. I think it's more like a window you finally open, letting air move through rooms that have been still for a long time. You don't erase what happened inside them. You just let it breathe. This house breathes now. So do I. And if someone were to ask me, at the very end, whether it was all worth it, the patience, the darkness, the years lived carefully around a rule I did not create, I would answer without pause. Yes. Because love is not proven by how much you see. It is proven by how faithfully you stay. And I stayed.